The sun was starting to set when Alan arrived at the cemetery. He'd always felt a peculiar attraction to abandoned places, especially cemeteries. The silence that enveloped them, the weight of time reflected in the worn gravestones, it all sparked a morbid curiosity within him. It was as if the cemetery was a portal to untold stories, secrets buried in the shadows of the tombs. This one, however, was different from any other he had visited. The entrance was surrounded by a rusted iron fence, the bars broken and the gate leaning, giving off an abandoned feel that seemed to extend across the entire property. The stone path, once carefully paved, was now covered with a thick layer of moss, and dry trees, twisted like fingers, cast distorted shadows on the ground. As Alan walked through the grounds, a strange sensation took over his body. The air was dense, heavy, as if the cemetery itself was suffocating the life around it. There was no sign of anyone else. No fresh flowers on the graves, no visitors. Only the sound of the wind, whispering through the dry leaves, seemed to break the oppressive silence. The cemetery, according to what Alan had read on a dark forum online, was known for its grim history. In the town center, no one spoke of it, but on those digital pages, rumors of mysteries and disappearances guarded for generations had spread like wildfire. The children buried there, they said, had died under strange and unexplained circumstances. But there was more, something the older locals spoke of in hushed, hurried tones. The cemetery had a section, isolated and forgotten by all, where these children were buried. The smell of damp earth, combined with the feeling of being watched, made Alan quicken his pace. But with every step, he felt a presence, a sensation as if something was always waiting for him, hidden among the trees in the shadows. He tried to ignore it, but a chill ran down his spine. Finally, after wandering for a while, he came across the first gravestone of a section that seemed completely different from the others. The gravestones were older, more worn, and grouped together in a way that made it look like a small, isolated field within the larger cemetery. There was something about those graves that made the place seem even darker, as if the very earth itself was trying to hide something. Alan crouched in front of one of the gravestones and read the inscription. In memory of Emily, 1874 to 1884. Eternal rest. The name meant nothing to him, but something in his soul seemed to tighten, as if that name was forever etched in his mind. He touched the gravestone with the tips of his fingers, feeling the coldness of the stone. That's when he heard it. For the first time, the sound. It was laughter, a soft, childish laugh coming from somewhere nearby. Alan froze, his eyes quickly scanning the surroundings, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was no one in sight. Only the wind, which now seemed stronger. But the laughter, it was closer now. He couldn't understand how, but it felt as though the very stones themselves were laughing. The sense of unease grew. Suddenly, Alan stood up, a wave of adrenaline sweeping through his body. His eyes frantically searched between the gravestones, but the shadows were too deep. He felt a step behind him, but when he turned around, no one was there. Only the silence, now heavier, more oppressive. He quickly stepped back, not fully understanding what was driving him to leave. The feeling of being watched was now unbearably intense. Alan tried to rationalize, to convince himself that it was all just his mind playing tricks, but there was something in the air, something that made him feel like he wasn't alone. And worse yet, the cemetery, with its unchanging silence, seemed to hide more than just bodies. He knew he would return. Something was calling him back. Something that wasn't human. Alan couldn't shake the thoughts about the cemetery. The childish laughter still echoed in his mind, blending with the sounds of the night that were starting to fill the emptiness around him. He tried to convince himself that he had been swept away by the darkness of the place, that the wind and his imagination had tricked him. But in the days that followed, he couldn't forget. Something had drawn him to that cemetery, something he couldn't understand. It was on the third day after the visit that he decided to go back. The idea of exploring the isolated section, the part of the cemetery that seemed to belong to no other, consumed his mind. Alan knew he needed to learn more about those children, about the stories no one wanted to tell. Something was wrong there, and he had to understand what it was. Upon returning to the cemetery, the atmosphere felt even more oppressive. The biting wind made him shiver for a moment, but his desire for answers kept him grounded. He followed the same path to the isolated section. This time, there was no longer that feeling of emptiness, but instead a palpable sense of discomfort, as if the very space around him was awaiting his presence. The gravestones were older than he remembered. Some were broken, others almost completely worn away, as if the earth itself was trying to erase them. The inscriptions, if they could still be read, were so corroded that he couldn't make out what they were trying to say. But one thing was clear. All the graves were of children. None of them were older than 10. As he walked further into the section, something peculiar caught his attention. In the back, a cluster of gravestones was set apart from the others, almost as if intentionally hidden. They were newer, the names still legible, but the aura around them was thick, as if they were trapped in time. Alan approached one of them and read the inscription. Thomas, 1886 to 1894. Lost in the shadows. The name, once again, meant nothing to him. But the phrase, lost in the shadows, sent a chill down his spine. It was as if that child had never found peace, as if Thomas's death was wrapped in something dark, something unexplainable. As he stared at the gravestone, a wave of coldness surrounded him, and the wind, which had been calm before, now seemed stronger. Something was coming. He spun around abruptly, his heart pounding faster, but when he looked around, there was nothing but shadows. He tried to push away the growing panic, telling himself that he was just imagining things, but the sound of small, muffled footsteps began to draw closer. Alan shivered. The footsteps were light, almost like the sound of little children's feet. He looked behind him, expecting to see some animal or maybe someone, but he was alone. The sound kept getting closer, until he felt completely surrounded. The soft laugh, the same one he had heard on his first day, echoed again, this time clearer and nearer. Alan turned once more, but still, there was no one. Then he noticed something strange. The gravestones, the old, worn ones, looked more distorted, as if the stones were shifting, changing as he looked at them. He approached one, trying to understand what was happening, but as his eyes traced the surface of the stone, he swore he saw something. A shadow, something moving within the depths of the inscription, as if it were trying to escape the stone itself. Alan stepped back, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and confusion. He was beginning to feel that the cemetery was more than just a resting place for the dead. There was something there, something that fed on fear, curiosity, and possibly the very souls of those who dared to come close. The wind began to blow harder, shaking the trees and making the gravestones creak in a sinister way. And it was at that moment that he heard, for the first time, the most disturbing sound. Footsteps behind him. He turned, but there was no one, only the void, the darkness, and the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The footsteps stopped. Alan stood frozen, trying to process what was happening. But what made him freeze, what truly made him lose any semblance of rationality, was the laugh. It was a child's laugh, cold, distant, but so close that he could feel the chill running down his spine. And then, as if the cemetery itself had begun to swallow the sound, a sharp, almost inhuman scream pierced the air. It was as if the children, those who were buried there, were trying to scream, trying to escape the place where they had been condemned to rest. The laugh turned into a distorted cackle, followed by a sound that resembled the cracking of bones and a scratching noise, as if something was trying to claw its way out of the earth. Alan didn't know what it was, but he felt like he shouldn't be there. The sensation of being invaded by something supernatural consumed him entirely. He needed to leave, but when he turned to go, the path behind him vanished. The cemetery was no longer the same. The night was growing thicker, and the cemetery seemed to swallow all the light around him. Alan was paralyzed, his body trembling as he tried to understand what was happening. The path that had been in front of him was now gone, leaving him lost in the middle of that maze of gravestones and shadows. The sound of footsteps still echoed in the distance, but he didn't know if it was real or if his mind was distorting from the terror. He looked around, trying to find an exit, something familiar. But the tall trees and ancient stones seemed to grow toward the sky, trapping him in that place. The fear was becoming unbearable, and the feeling of being watched intensified with every passing second. But there was something else. Something Alan couldn't identify. He knew there was something unusual there. The children buried in that cemetery weren't just victims of fate. There was a pattern to the graves, something he was only beginning to notice now. With heavy steps, Alan made his way back to the newer gravestones, the ones that had caught his attention earlier. He felt like something there needed to be understood. Maybe there were clues, something that would explain what was happening. He crouched in front of another gravestone, his eyes scanning the inscription. Margaret, 1873 to 1881. She smiled in death. He frowned, the phrase echoing in his mind. She smiled in death. Those words felt unsettling, yet somehow familiar, as if he had read something similar before. He felt a wave of curiosity and fear. The words weren't just strange. They were sinister. Alan stood up abruptly, his eyes scanning the area around him, as if something was about to leap out from the darkness. The gravestones, which had once seemed scattered and forgotten, now seemed organized, as if they were forming a pattern he couldn't comprehend. He looked at the names, trying to make sense of them, when something caught his attention. On a gravestone further away, one inscription stood out more clearly than the others. Alice, 1876 to 1884. The darkness set her free. Alan took a step back, his mind filling with questions. Why were these phrases so specific? Why did they all speak of an unusual death? What had these children experienced before they died? And why did their souls seem trapped in that place? The answer was closer than he realized, but he didn't know how to reach it. Suddenly, a sound caught his attention. It was laughter. The same laughter he had heard before, but now it didn't come from a distant point. It came from all directions, echoing between the gravestones, enveloping him like a heavy cloak of horror. The feeling of being watched intensified. He felt as if he were being swallowed by the night, by the very essence of the place. That's when he realized that something was moving in the shadows. Small figures, like children, were running between the gravestones, their bodies distorted and skeletal, their shadows grotesquely projected. Their eyes were empty, as if their souls had already been consumed by the darkness. Alan's heart raced. He wanted to scream, to run, but something kept him there. Something held him in place, trapped. He took a step forward, almost instinctively, and then saw the most terrifying sign of all, a small child, standing in front of a gravestone, staring directly at him. Its face was pale and lifeless, its eyes dark like black holes. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching him. Alan swallowed hard. The child didn't seem real, but at the same time, its presence was so intense that he could almost feel its frozen breath on his skin. He tried to move closer, but before he could take another step, the child vanished into the darkness with a quick movement, as if it had been sucked into the shadows. The laughter grew louder, now more intense, more unbearable, like a wave of dread crashing over him. He looked around, searching for an explanation, but the scene in front of him was becoming more and more distorted. The figures of the children appeared and disappeared in the shadows, their laughter, their screams, their disturbing presences filling the air. Alan took a step back, but there was no path left. He was surrounded by these children, or whatever was left of them. He felt like he was being consumed, not physically, but something in his mind, something in his soul, was being taken. He didn't know what these children wanted, what they expected from him, but one thing was clear: he shouldn't be there. And then, before he could react, he heard one final laugh, louder, closer. The laugh of a child, but distorted, grotesque, as if it were an echo of eternal suffering. Alan shut his eyes, trying to control his breath, but the weight of the cemetery seemed to crush him. He no longer knew what was real. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, a place where the lines between the living and the dead, the real and the imagined, were vanishing. And he knew, without a doubt, that he would never leave. Alan awoke in a nightmare, or at least, that's what he thought when his eyes opened. But the truth was even more disturbing. He was no longer in the cemetery. Or perhaps he was, but in a distorted way. The environment around him felt muffled, the air heavy, as if it were hard to breathe. What terrified him the most, however, wasn't the lack of light or the suffocating environment, but the feeling that something was watching his every move. He was in a familiar place, yet at the same time unrecognizable. The old church, near the cemetery, where he always passed by while walking through the area, stood before him, but distorted. The walls were dark, almost as if they had been corroded by time and pain. The place seemed to have been swallowed by the shadows, and the cross on the wall, which had once been intact, was now broken and crooked, as if it had been ripped from its place. But the most terrifying feeling was the presence of the children. They were there, but not like before. They were no longer fleeting shadows or distant laughter. They were fixed, standing still, like statues of silent terror. Their eyes, dark as black holes, followed him from every corner. Their bodies were distorted, their forms undefined, and as he moved, the children seemed to approach, as if his very movement was a lure to an abyss he couldn't avoid. "You shouldn't have come back," a thin, sweet voice whispered behind Alan. He turned abruptly, but there was no one. The sound came from the very shadows, from the figures now surrounding him. But they could not be seen clearly. Fear took hold of his body. He could no longer trust his own senses. What was happening to him? Those children, the footsteps, the laughter, everything seemed to blend into an incoherent mass of anguish. Alan knew that something much deeper was going on, something that surpassed any logical explanation. He was not just in a cemetery or in a church. He was trapped in a cycle of death and suffering. As he tried to understand what was happening, he remembered the phrases inscribed on the children's gravestones. Lost in the shadows, she smiled in death. The darkness set her free. Those weren't just riddles. They were clues to a much greater mystery. Something that connected all those deaths. Something that kept the children's souls trapped in that place, condemned to relive their final hours, their last moments, in an eternal cycle. Not knowing where to go, Alan began to walk through the church. The sound of his footsteps echoed, but with each movement, he felt they were being followed. He looked back, and then he saw it. One of the children, with a pale face and dark eyes, a twisted, sinister smile. It stood still in the center of the church aisle, watching him with an intensity that made him freeze in place. "Why are we here?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear. He didn't know if he was speaking to himself or to the child before him, but something told him the answer was near, much nearer than he imagined. The child didn't respond immediately. It simply took a small step forward, and suddenly, a wave of cold energy enveloped Alan. He felt his skin prickle, as if an invisible hand had touched him, whispering in his ears the darkest secrets of all those deaths. And then the child spoke. "We were not just victims. We were chosen." The phrase echoed in Alan's mind, like a muffled scream. He took a step back, his heart racing. What did it mean? Chosen? But for what? And by whom? The darkness did not set us free. It consumed us, the child said, her voice now more distant, almost an echo lost in the cold breeze of the church. And now, you too are part of the cycle. Panic rose within Alan. He was beginning to understand, and what he understood terrified him even more. The children weren't just trapped by death. They were trapped by something else, something that had marked them, something that kept them alive in the darkness. And now, he was part of it. He was being dragged into the same cycle, into the same darkness. The child's eyes became deeper, as if absorbing his soul. Alan tried to move away, but his legs felt heavy, as if the earth was holding him firmly in place. He tried to run, but his body wouldn't obey. Everything around him was spinning, the walls of the church distorting, the shadows growing. "You will see what we saw," the child whispered with a twisted smile. "You'll hear the laughter and the footsteps. You'll never be able to leave." And then, suddenly, Alan understood. He wasn't in a nightmare. He was in an eternal cycle, and the only way to escape would be to never return. He collapsed to his knees, desperate, as the laughter of the children began to invade his mind, and the sound of footsteps drew nearer. The darkness was consuming him, and he knew that, in the end, he would never see the light again. Alan no longer knew where the nightmare began and where it ended. The cycle was becoming more and more impenetrable, and his attempts to escape were growing increasingly futile. He was trapped, not in a cemetery or in a church, but inside an invisible prison, a prison that extended beyond the walls of any physical place. He no longer knew if this was real, or if his mind was distorting under the pressure of endless terror. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, as if he were being pulled downward, as if an invisible force were controlling his movements. The children, those lost souls, watched him from every angle. Their inhuman figures projected in the shadows, their empty, lifeless eyes reflecting the infinite pain they seemed to carry. It was a pain that he now felt too, as if his own emotions were being drained, as if the very essence of who he was disappearing before his eyes. The children's laughter echoed, now louder and more constant, like a distorted scream filling every space in his mind. He no longer knew what was happening around him. The sounds of the laughter had turned into an irritating hum, a constant pressure on his ears and sanity. The children spoke in unison, but their words were incomprehensible, as if they were being spoken underwater, distorted and unreal. "You were once one of them. You already belong to this place," a voice whispered in his ear, like a heavy breath coming from the shadows. "You are just another lost soul. There is no escape." Alan wanted to scream, but his voice was trapped, suffocated by the crushing pressure of the place. He was completely immersed in darkness now, and every step he took, every movement he tried to make, seemed to stretch out in time, as if he were slowly being consumed by the earth itself. He fell to his knees, his bones aching from the invisible pressure surrounding him. It was as if gravity had become 10 times stronger, as if the cemetery itself was trying to swallow his soul. Alan tried to rise, but his strength was fading. He felt a growing presence around him, an evil energy gathering like a storm about to explode. And then he saw it, or maybe it was what he thought he saw. The children were there, closer than ever, forming a circle around him. Their eyes were dark, empty, and their faces were a mass of grotesque distortions, as if they had been sculpted by something that didn't belong to reality. But, looking closer, Alan saw something even more horrifying. There was a shadow behind the children, a presence larger than all of them, a figure projecting from the shadows like a nightmare materialized. It was the same presence he had felt from the beginning, something watching him from afar, something drawing him to this place, something that seemed to feed on his pain and fear. "She's here," a hissing voice murmured, and Alan understood. "She is the one who binds us, the one who keeps us alive in the darkness. She is the reason we cannot rest." The figure behind the children moved closer, its presence becoming clearer. Alan felt a wave of despair, as if his strength were being drained with each passing second. He tried to move, tried to scream, but all he could do was stare at that shadow with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The presence was now in front of him, and what he saw made him freeze in terror. It was a female figure, but not human. Her body was skeletal, her hands long and thin, like claws reaching out toward Alan. Her eyes were deep and empty, as if there were no soul within them. The figure's mouth was slightly open, but it made no sound. It was as if she was waiting for something. Alan knew what it was. He knew that figure was the key to the mystery, the reason the children were trapped there, the reason he was there. He felt an immense weight on his chest, as if he were being pulled into it, as if his very life were being sucked into the darkness. "You made a choice," the figure whispered, its words freezing Alan's spine. "Now, you belong to me. Darkness is your only home." Alan tried to fight, but his strength was fading. He felt the darkness consuming his soul, and everything around him was crumbling. The faces of the children turning into smudges, the shadows distorting into unidentifiable shapes. And then he understood. He wasn't in a nightmare. He was dead. He had died when he entered that cemetery, when he allowed himself to be drawn in by curiosity and fear. And now, he was trapped there with the other children, with the other souls, doomed to relive their last hours in an eternal cycle of suffering. Alan could no longer see. He could no longer feel. He was being consumed by the darkness, and the last thing he heard was the laughter of the children, echoing in his mind, a promise that he would never leave. Alan woke up, but he wasn't sure if it was still a dream. Or was it worse? Perhaps the nightmare had no end. The same eyes, the same shadows. The silence was deafening, a cold stillness that surrounded him, impenetrable. He didn't know how much time had passed since his last perception of reality, or what remained of it. He slowly got up, feeling his legs tremble. The cemetery, the place he thought he had escaped from, was back. But now he knew, with painful clarity, there was no escape. The cemetery was watching him. He was no longer a mere spectator, but a prisoner in his own cell. The tombstones were there, silent, but to Alan, they were no longer just graves. They were portals, capsules of an eternal cycle, a chain of souls that could never rest. The old tree, which once seemed insignificant, was now the center of everything. Its roots deeply entrenched in the soil of what couldn't be seen, but was felt. The ground moved, undulated, as if the children, those who were once innocent souls, were waiting for more. The faint light of a waxing moon illuminated the macabre scene. The wind howled, but there was no freshness. It was a sigh of something that had never lived, something that had been lost a long time ago. Alan tried to walk, but his feet wouldn't move, as if the earth held him with invisible claws. He looked around, and there they were again, the children. Now, they were everywhere, watching him, no longer with the empty, grotesque stares he had seen before. No, their eyes were fixed on him with a cold understanding. They knew what he had become. They knew what he would have to face. Those distorted, light-hearted laughs began to echo, like a soft song played in the shadows, coming from the depths of the abyss. Alan tried to scream, but his voice didn't respond. His throat was dry, as if the air was no longer his. The children began to walk toward him, their footsteps echoing in the graves. They were the same but different. "You finally understand," one of the childlike voices spoke, its tone gentle but heavy with an unmistakable threat. Alan felt his soul wither. He knew what was happening now. The words, the murmurs of suffering. It was all part of a cycle he could not interrupt. The figure of the woman, the entity that had consumed him before, reappeared. She was behind every child, a shadow that stretched across the entire cemetery, a presence that touched everything around her. She drew closer, her long, thin claws scraping the ground, the sound of her dark flesh dragging against the earth as if it were made of broken glass. Alan felt a rising wave of fear. His own mind was breaking into pieces, as if everything he was would unravel before that sight. "This is no longer a nightmare, Alan. This is no longer an illusion," the figure whispered, her voice making his flesh tremble. "You are one of us now. And now, you will be part of the cycle, like all the souls that came before you. Lost. Forever." Alan could no longer fight. He could no longer run. He tried to close his eyes, but what he saw in his mind was worse. He saw himself in every one of the gravestones. He saw each child that had died there. He saw their faces twisted by pain and suffering. He now understood that death was not the end, but the beginning of an endless prison. The souls of the children were not lost. They were being fed by the darkness, by the figure that ruled over them. And now, he had become one of them. The woman drew even closer, her clawed hands reaching toward him. Alan felt his body start to fade, his limbs becoming ethereal, his vision distorted. And the only thing he could perceive was the crushing weight of the darkness pressing against his soul. The last thing he heard was a low laugh, a cruel laugh from the children, echoing in the wind. They were laughing, not in pleasure, but in a shared understanding. They were all there, prisoners of a cycle that could never be broken. "Now, you will see what we saw," the woman said, her words muffled by the darkness that had already consumed Alan. "Now, you are part of the darkness, like all of us." And then, with the feeling of being swallowed by an immense void, Alan was lost in the shadows. The cycle closed.